Hi, everyone. I'm Sasha Kramer, and I'm just giving a quick introduction to OCB scoping workshop. This is looking at extreme events. In this workshop, we're planning to bring together a group of people, modelers, observationalists, anybody who works on the impacts of extreme events in controlling carbon storage, release, and transformation in the coastal and estuarine environment. And so as you'll see in the session that's to come, there are a lot of different definitions of what an extreme event is in the ocean. In this case, our goal is primarily to bring together people who are working on these more acute extreme events, so specifically hurricanes and wildfires. This workshop is going to be held in October at North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina, and we're planning to hold it in person. So if this description includes you or people that you know, we'd be very interested in having you attend. We're planning to have the meeting in person, but there may be some talks that are recorded. So if you don't feel like you can make it in person, then maybe you can participate afterward. Our workshop application is not open yet, but it's going to open next month. So this QR code will bring you to an expression of interest form that you can fill out if you want to make sure you can be on the list for future communications about this workshop. And OCB will continue to advertise the workshop and the application once it's open. So if you have more questions this week, please come and find me or feel free to send me an email. And I will turn it over to these two.
Hi, everyone. You hear me? Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to our session. My name is Patrick Rafter. I'd like to introduce my fellow co-organizers, Randy Bundy and Victoria Coles. And so today we have, I think, a very interesting collection of speakers for you today. We have a list here. Nicolas Gruber, who will be here virtually, Regina, Rodrigues, Pincelli Hull, right here, and then followed up by Britten. So we'll have a break between after the second speaker, after Regina, and then we will come back and we'll finish it with a panel discussion. Each talk is 25 minutes with a 5-minute buffer space there for questions. But if you want to save your questions to the end, that's good too. So we'll have this nice panel discussion and then dinner, I think, right? Okay, so that's all. Let's get going with Nikki.
Okay, so welcome everyone. I hope you hear me well. Otherwise, please send me right away a chat. First of all, thanks a lot for the invitation, and many thanks for also having the opportunity to talk remotely at this exciting session. I always remember the many OCB events that I had the opportunity to attend, and they're really fantastic places and opportunities to get together and talk about exciting science. So I really miss the opportunity, but at the same time, I really like the fact that we actually now these days can do these talks also remotely, giving at least a part of the opportunities back. So I'd like to start the session with an overview of the research that primarily my research group has been doing in the last few years, but also collaborating with good and dear colleagues such as Thomas Fröhlicher and Phil Boyd. And so what I'm trying to give is kind of an overview of where we are with respect to the question of extreme events associated with marine heat waves and also biogeochemical extreme events. So it's a subset of all the extreme events that we're going to be talking about. And as you all know, a good starting point for the discussion are the marine heat waves, because we know already for quite some time that those marine heat waves has a significant impact on marine life. Have been, of course, best documented in terms of coral bleaching. We also understand that these marine heat waves have increased in the past few decades quite considerably, and the main driver for that increase is the rise in atmospheric CO2 that leads then to a rise in temperature, which in atmospheric temperature, then that pushes essentially an extra amount of heat into the ocean, warms the surface ocean, and that increases the likelihood of marine heat waves. And this is something that we observationally have been able to demonstrate that the number, intensity, and severity of marine heat waves have significantly increased over the observation period. And we go into the future, we have actually even a larger increase in store, even if we actually manage somehow to stay within the 1.5 degree or the 2 degree target of the Paris Agreement. And we also have now, there's a very significant amount of research has been done to go beyond the impact of coral reefs, but also looking at fish and other marine ecosystems. And it's quite clear that these marine heat waves, as they are on land, are quite devastating. So a big question that has sort of been a motivation for me for working on this is in what way do the other stressors, so ocean acidification and the loss of oxygen, lead also to such extreme event? Of course, they have to, but the question is there going to be some impact of those? And is there actually also some compounding effect where these sort of extreme events come together and act in a synergistic way, leading to enhanced damage? And it's very likely that this is going to be happening because we all know that the fact that we have an increase in the marine heat waves is associated with the CO2, and that CO2 causes an increase in the ocean's acidity through the ocean uptake of anthropogenic CO2. And the same drivers that we have that actually are important for driving marine heat waves, such as changing ocean temperature, but also changing in stratification, they also are important drivers for causing low oxygen extremes. So we kind of, from a mechanistic point of view, we can expect that there's some compounding effect because the overall drivers for those is actually ultimately the same, i.e. the increase in atmospheric CO2. So that's the big question we're after. And more specifically, what we'd like to understand, what are the characteristics of these extremes? Where do they occur? Where they are more intense? How often do they occur? So just the characterization of the hazard itself. Then how have they developed through time? And in what way do these developments lead to an enhanced effect in terms of compounding, but also in terms of connection of these extremes with El Nino and other phenomena? And the last question, and that's the piece we already just really started to put some first grips on, is how these extreme events will impact marine life. Because at the moment, the fact is we know very little about them. And we know even less if we start to think in terms of, okay, what are the specific impacts of what I call double whammy, the double compound events where ocean acidification extremes and marine heat waves co-occur, or the same is occurring with low oxygen extreme. Or even worse, I think we almost know nothing about marine ecosystem impact when it comes to triple compound extremes, where all three elements are extreme at the same time or very close sequence. So today I will try to address these three questions. Given the time, I don't have time to go, there's not enough time to go into all details, so some aspects will be put more light on, other less. So please bear with me that this is just a selection of the most important outcomes of the research of the last few years on this topic. But before I start, it's very important that we talk about definitions, and that will be also one of the discussion elements in the panel. I think when things are relatively steady background, and we have a flickering system, then that system will generate extremes by definition. And particularly if we take essentially relative threshold approach, where we looking at this at the probability density function, and then try to identify, okay, what is extreme? So to this event, we usually look at specific thresholds. They're somewhat arbitrary. We often work in my group with the 5th percentile or the 95th percentile. And once we have identified those thresholds for a given base period, which we assume doesn't have an underlying trend, then we can actually identify the high extremes and the low extremes in a statistical sense. I think that is relatively straightforward to do. A more difficult situation arises and when actually there is a trend in the data. And as a matter of fact, when it comes to ocean acidity, we have a very, very strong trend relative to the natural variability. So this becomes a huge issue, how we deal with the situation when we have a strong trend. So one perspective is that we use what we call a fixed baseline. We kind of continue to use the thresholds that we have identified from the baseline periods. That could be ideally that may be a pre-industrial baseline or something in the past for which I have good observations for. And if I use this fixed baseline and continue, of course, what will happen is that we'll see a very rapid increase in the number of hot extremes or high extremes. And if then at one point in time, the variability go outside of my prior distribution, and then I get more or less in a situation of a continuous hot or high extreme. Well, there might be actually a situation where this is the appropriate view. In my research group, we have been discussing this quite extensively and decided, particularly when it comes to ocean acidification, to think in terms of a shifting baseline. So we look essentially at the distribution as it continuously evolves essentially along the underlying long-term trend. And then in this case, really just identify the extremes that are above that time evolving distribution, or the percentiles, the 5th and the 95th percentile evolve in time too. And then we only look at the data below or above those thresholds. And what I'm going to be presenting today, we exclusively use actually that perspective, that shifting baseline. But we have to understand, by doing so, we take actually a very strong underlying trend out of the data. And so we're just looking at the extremes that go beyond what you just expect from in terms of the long-term evolution of the system. That doesn't mean the underlying ocean acidification does not matter. All we're looking at are the extremes above that evolving background are special or need special attention. So that's the perspective we're taking here. Good, so let's start with the distribution. We're actually using here models for that, and we run them for pre-industrial time, so that corresponds essentially to the period where we had a more or less constant climate. So this is based on the Nature paper we published a couple of months ago, in December last year, and these are model simulations from the GFDL model, just to give a little bit of an idea where are these extremes and how intense they are. So what plotted actually is the intensity in colors, and on the left-hand side you see the surface distribution of these extremes, and on the right-hand side you see the distribution at 200-meter steps, to give also a bit of a differentiation between what happens at the surface and what happens in the ocean's interior. And we can see that when it comes to the surface, we have essentially the strongest extremes in the tropics and in the mid to high latitudes, whereas at depths, actually we have actually the strongest heat waves in the tropics, mostly associated with essentially the planetary waves that pass through the equatorial Pacific in the context of El Niño, La Niña fluctuations. So what about pH? So here looking actually at in terms of hydrogen ion concentrations. So just overlaying. So wherever we see essentially mixture of colors means that in the same places we have both strong hydrogen extremes or ocean acidification extremes and low and high strong marine heat waves. And again, kind of in the surface tropics to mid latitudes, the high latitudes kind of fall a bit out. So it's more the temperate latitudes that now play a very important role. And at depth, actually, the tropics continue to be kind of the hot spot. And that's even true when we actually include low oxygen extremes. So when it comes to what happens at depths, I think it's very, very clear we need to focus a great deal in the lower latitudes, a bit less in the higher latitudes. Whereas at the surface, it's a bit almost like the mirror image of that. And that's kind of an interesting perspective when we actually think in terms of marine ecosystem impact. Are we looking at animals that live perhaps at 200-meter depths? they might experience the extremes very differently from organisms that primarily live at the surface. So can we actually now take a step beyond models? And working together with Nicolas Gruber, we've been actually assembling observations, actually based on exactly the types of observations that you heard in the previous session from SOCAT and GLODAP, and assembled those into a consistent data set of ocean acidification. And from that, we now are assessing actually ocean acidification extremes, and we use also satellite observations of SST to look at marine heat waves. And here, what the focus is, okay, are the events that we saw before that just co-occur in space, are they actually now also co-occurring in time, actually being true compound events where both conditions are extreme? And that's actually not the case. For example, we see in the tropics here a region where we have no compound extreme of the type marine heat wave and ocean acidification extreme, because whenever we have a very warm conditions during El Nino, actually the pH is actually relatively high, so anything but an extreme event. At the same time, if we go actually away from the tropics, we see actually the whole sort of subtropical to temperate latitude bands. We find this compounding of marine heat waves and ocean acidification extremes happening quite regularly. And what we're looking at in the last plot here is the joint intensity. It's not a lot of time to go into details, but we're categorizing the marine heat waves in categories following Hopday's definition. We do the same for ocean acidification, and then do a Euclidean distance addition of the two to get actually a compound index. And what you can see is that we actually get a couple of really interesting hotspots, and particularly here in the North Pacific, that I will talk about later in terms of compound extremes. So when you think in terms of this compound extreme between ocean acidification and marine heat waves, this is primarily a mid-latitude phenomenon. Going further, we can actually look at individual events, and Luke has looked at the duration of individual events plotted in the X direction, and the intensity that I just explained before. And what we find, on average, not a very sound, but very strong statistically significant relationship, but on average, we find that the extreme events that are long lasting tend also to be more intense. What you see also in terms of the colors is the event area, how big they are, and in gray in the background, you see actually the number of events, and what you find is actually the majority of events tend to be short lasting, 2 to 3 months. It can be quite intense, some of them a few, but the really intense one here, they're very rare. They occur less than 1% of all times. But it's interesting to look where they occur. So we identified them individually, and you find the majority of them actually happened just in the last 20 years. And by far the largest is the blob area. But we also see very well-known heat wave events, as the Tasman Sea heat wave, the 2011 heat wave. And the reason for that is that a lot of these very, very strong heat waves, the temperatures go so up that actually the increased temperature has a very strong effect on the hydrogen ion concentration dissociation constant. And actually that leads actually to a connection between, a thermodynamic connection between heat waves and ocean acidification. On top of that, there is also actually dynamical adjustments in terms of stratification, etc., that come into play. So what about the depths? I mentioned before, we shouldn't be just looking at the surface, but because a lot of things are also happening at depths. And for that, I'm actually using results from a regional model that we run actually for the whole Pacific, with a focal area on the coast of the United States and Canada. It's a hindcast simulation for the last 40 years, from 1980 onward, forced with daily era interim forcing, so receives winds and freshwater fluxes and heat fluxes from that analysis. And in this particular case, actually, we go a bit more extreme. We're looking at the 1st and the 99th percentile of things. And in the movie I'm going to show, we go actually now beyond just the surface perspective. What we're doing is we'd like to look actually how these extremes lead actually to habitat reduction. So that we're looking the extreme can happen anywhere in the water column in the top 250 meters. And we look at what fraction of that top 250 meters is extreme with respect to a particular property, whether it's a pH, whether it's oxygen, or temperature, or some combination thereof. So the intensity of the colors, if it's light, then there's not much extreme. If it goes in the dark colors, 70% of the water column is affected by any of these extremes. And I hope the animation will now run. And so what you see first is actually any stressor in that. And now in red, you see actually the heat wave. You see some of them are quite deep, some of them very shallow, sort of shades passing by. Now we go into oxygen extremes, that we see this eddy structure, very dark color, meaning a very significant fraction of the water column is affected. The same is true for pH. And you see that a very significant fraction of these eddy structures or of these extremes are associated with eddies. But we see also upwelling events here along the coast of the continent. And now as we go actually into the blob area, you see actually now sort of a very significantly different evolution with a not much more broad scale distribution of compound extremes. The colors now indicate the compounding. The red indicates now the development of the blob. And in orange yet is actually the final stage where we have actually triple whammies, where essentially all of these events are extreme at the same time. And that was in the period of 2013 to 2015. And so we are now towards the end of the simulation. And what I'm doing next is to actually focus in on one of these periods, of July 2015. So I'm just highlighting again as a standing image the different extreme types. So if it's blue, meaning it's a low oxygen event, sour pH event, then it's a combination of oxygen and pH, hot, of course. And then hot to no breath is temperature and oxygen, and this is temperature and pH, and black is the triple whammy, where all three situations are extreme. And you can see that we have a very large region here off the coast of Canada and the US, where the situation was during this blob event towards the end of it in a triple whammy situation. And so if we've looked in the model at the vertical distribution of temperature, oxygen, and pH, as shown here on the right-hand side, and you can see that the warm temperatures extended quite deep into the water column. Certainly the top 100 meters were strongly affected. Oxygen was also strongly depleted in the surface ocean. Actually at depths, at least in the model, it was enhanced. And pH was very strongly reduced during the upper ocean as well. And here I indicated now in the colors, the part of the water column that was this is an average profile over the whole area on the left-hand side, where we have a triple whammy situation. Underneath, we have a hot and sour situation. And here we have actually, even going all the way down to 250 meters, we have a hot situation. So meaning that actually for ecosystems, for organisms, if you were sensitive to any of these two, there was not a lot of volume left of water for you to be in. So the only chance you had was to move laterally. But also that is somewhat limited given the distance you have to travel in order to avoid essentially these triple whammy situations. So here's how it looks actually through time. These heat waves and actually low oxygen events and low pH events, they're happening every once in a while. But if you compare to any of the previous year, these blob events was just extraordinarily unusual, not only in temperature, but also in the development of these low oxygen conditions and the low pH conditions. And inside here, you see at the bottom here, you see the volume, the area, not the volume effect, the area affected by this triple extreme event. So this was definitely a showcase, I would say, in terms of how bad situations could get. So one of the questions we've been trying to tackle is the processes that could lead to such single or double or triple compound extremes. And there's a number of candidate processes that I don't want to go into the details, but involve things like air-sea interactions, then also shifts of lateral or vertical gradients. We also have wind-induced variability induced by upwelling, and a lot of the mesoscale eddies that I showed you in the animations, driving oxygen extremes by encapsulating unusually cold or low pH waters, or usually low oxygen waters, and traveling with that volume of water into waters that are much higher oxygen. That, of course, creates locally very highly unusual conditions, but it's also the trapping can lead to, because of local enhanced thermalization, could lead to a reduction of oxygen or a reduction in pH as a consequence of a biological reminization. So in the end, we're looking at really a fascinating interaction between physical, biogeochemical, and biological processes that lead to this. But so far, we don't have yet sort of a global assessment of these processes. But Flora Desmet just published a paper a few months ago where we looked at that exactly for ocean acidification extremes in the region we just showed you in the animation. And what she was able to identify that there's a lot of different processes that are local upwelling events that are, but also local flickering, partly associated with eddies. But the biggest event, and particularly when it comes also in terms of the overall severity, the total volume affected, are actually events that start as upwelling extremes and then form essentially mesoscale structure, coherent vortices that travel actually westward and carry essentially that information with them, i.e. the extreme conditions. And they're very long lasting. They can last up to several years and really create very, very different conditions from anything around that. And the implication of that finding is that if we want to study extremes, we need to go to the scale of where most of these extremes are happening, and that's actually the mesoscale. And that's, of course, challenging from an observation as well as from a modeling point of view. So the last thing I'd like to talk about, what about the impact on organisms? And I said we're just at the beginning of this, but one approach we've been taking is to use actually individually based models. And this is an individually based model for pteropod that lives in the California current system, that hatches eggs, larvae develop from that, then juveniles, and ultimately then adults that at the end actually lay eggs. So, and you see the different colors, eggs, larvae, juvenile. Now we go into the summer where we really develop a large summer population of larvae. They become actually now juveniles, and then ultimately they turn into adults from which actually eggs produce. And so of course, these are vertically migrating up and down. And whenever they migrate down, they actually encounter at depths extreme conditions in terms of the saturation horizon. And we're looking at in terms of the saturation. And what's particularly sensitive for these organisms is when they reach waters where the saturation state is less than 1.5. And whenever you see this kind of flickering then in the movie, it's actually when these organisms in their diurnal vertical migration encounter such an extreme event. So we start to see it now again as we, every once in a while, this flickering, particularly now at the beginning, you see that quite nicely. And so we can follow these individual organisms and look at, okay, what does this do to them? And we can compare that to organisms that do not experience that extreme by just removing the impact of the extreme. Something you can do very well in the model. And lo and behold, of course, these extremes have an impact. And what they do, actually, they increase the mortality quite significantly. And of course, the stronger the intensity of the extremes are, the more the mortality of the organisms is impacted. And that affects actually all life stages, but even more so the adult life stages. But it also leads actually to dissolution of their shells that reduces the fitness, their ability to grow. And so they grow more slowly, and that decreases actually their overall size. And both of these effects together, what they ultimately do is they reduce the likelihood of any spawned egg to develop into another spawning adult. So it reduces really the overall recruitment of a cohort when they are exposed to these extremes. And we have yet to fully quantify that, but that's essentially the outcome of that research so far. We also have to say that, particularly when it comes to ocean acidification, the extremes are extreme, of course, but at the same time, actually, the underlying trend is very, very strong as well. And so this is a situation where actually both extreme and the long-term underlying trend, actually both of them go in the same direction and actually compound each other on top of the classical compound between different extreme types. So this is also something that we are investigating right now. And that brings me to closure. I think the first statement is when it comes to extremes, that if we do not remove that long-term trend, that as most of what I showed you, one has to understand they become more frequent, they become more severe, and they're going to have more impact. And they just amplify essentially the underlying trends that we have in these stressors, i.e. ocean warming, loss of oxygen, and ocean acidification. And the cause of all of that, we know, is the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere as a consequence of the CO2 emissions from human activities. Second point is that we have actually a couple of interesting case studies now in the blob. Appears to be one of those compound extremes where really the situations were extreme with respect to all three stressors. And that's most likely something that we have that, I mean, we don't know for sure, but it's a conjecture. That is something that with good likelihood did not exist before. And I think the big open question, I think we have actually quite good ideas, we're making good progress with respect to the identification of the hazard. But I think where we are really struggling at the moment is to fully understand how these extremes impact marine life and who's sensitive, who's less sensitive, which life form, life stage is more vulnerable than others. What does it do to a whole ecosystem if you knock out essentially some keystone species in an ecosystem, etc. And in the review we've written, we tried essentially to look at those dimensions from the physiological perspective into organismic perspective, population, all the way into ecosystem perspective, and try to identify how the different characteristics of extremes that we have not talked about yet, just focused here on intensity, a little bit on duration, but there's also other factors such as abruptness, how fast an extreme develops, how all of these elements sort of impact various dimensions of ecosystems. And on the other hand, what are the resilience and resistance strategies that ecosystems and organisms might have to cope with these situations? And with that, I close, and I'm sure we have plenty of things to talk about in the panel, but I think now the floor is open for just some specific questions.
I'm really happy to be here after some time. I did my PhD in GSO, Rhode Island, nearby, and I would like to thank the scientific committee to invite me to be here. And today I'll be talking about common drivers of compound extreme events in the ocean and on land. So marine heat waves are periods of extreme ocean temperature. They can cause devastating impact on marine life. They have different physical mechanisms and drivers. And in any case, they co-occur with other extremes. They just show us that they are associated with extremes of acidification and deoxygenation, but they can also co-occur with extreme events on land, such as droughts and heat waves. This is very important because our understanding of the physical drivers of these extremes on land and our capability of predicting them are much more advanced, and we should use this to our advantage, expand much quicker our understanding and capability of predicting marine heat waves. And we needed to look at the problem more holistically. So my talk, I will focus on the physical mechanism and drivers that lead to compound extremes on land and marine heat waves. So this is a schematic of the drivers of marine heat waves on the left, and that impacts on oceanic and coastal ecosystems on the right. Surface marine heat waves are caused by local ocean and atmosphere heat flux affecting surface mix layer. These processes are controlled by local synoptic system that can be modulated by large-scale climate oscillation and anthropogenic warming. Impacts, obviously, you might be aware of it, range across trophic levels, often affecting human systems. So to simplify, we can divide the local drivers into two categories: air-sea interaction and ocean processes. Many of the iconic extratropical marine heat waves have been associated with persistent high-pressure system or blocking highs over the ocean, and they're resulting air-sea interaction. So atmospheric blocking reduces cloud cover, enhance insolation, and suppress surface wind speeds, resulting in hot, dry weather systems. And collectively, these conditions reduce sensible latent ocean heat flux and increase solar radiation heating, in turn warming sea surface temperatures. So marine heat waves, on the other hand, have been caused by anomalous advection of warmer waters. So ocean circulation changes can also precondition the ocean for marine heat wave development. So they can be caused by atmosphere, but they also So here is an example of iconic events caused by ocean processes only. It occurred along the Western Australian coast in 2011. It was caused by anomalous poleward advection of warm tropical waters into temperate regions associated with a strong 2010-11. Panel illustrates the spatial extension of the event, and the bottom panel shows as well how they are generally defined. And this method heat wave events occur when sea surface exceeds the threshold. Consecutive threshold is defined as these two notable events, on the other hand, were caused by air-sea interaction. The Northern Mediterranean Sea in 2003 on the left, and the Northwest Atlantic event in 2012 on the right. Both were caused by a persistent atmospheric blocking that increased the heat. So the MED event was associated with when 30,000 people died. The consequence for marine ecosystems were also devastating. So perhaps the most known, and we've heard already from Nick, event is the North Pacific blob that lasted 2 years and peaked in Boreal in winters of 2014 and 15. Here I showed SST anomalies on the left of 2000 SST anomalies. Well, the first blob was caused by a weakening of the illusion law, related surface wind. The blob 2.0, as it's called, during summer and was caused by a weakening of the north evaporative fraction that led to. Again, they were caused by air-sea interaction and were associated with dry and hot conditions. Studies focus only on the marine heat wave, and we have many more studies that focus only. Now, study that I have done for the West and South Atlantic to identify the common drivers not only of marine heat waves, but also extreme on land. In austral summer of 2013-14, Eastern South America experienced one of its worst droughts, showing on the left panel as negative anomaly of precipitation. The contours are the climatology, and normally at this time of the year, we would have a band of rain called the South Atlantic Convergence Zone. Associated with the drought, extremes of air temperature occurred on the land, the right panel, and at the same time, an unprecedented marine heat wave. Temperatures reaching compound. So for those of you that are not familiar with it, the establishment of the South Atlantic Convergence Zone during austral summer characterized the South American monsoon system and is the source of rain to East and South America. The convergence zone is a band of strong precipitation associated with a cyclone channels most of the Amazon towards southeast Brazil. In the summer of 2013, however, after cyclonic established over southeast Brazil, preventing the development. And cyclonic circulation is linked to the wave breaking in the upper atmosphere. So, when we apply the same methodology by Hobday et al. 2016 to identify all marine heat wave events during austral summer for the period from 1982 to 2016, we realized that up to 60% of the marine heat wave days simultaneously for all events is shown on the left panel. The mean signature of the SST warming for all events is similar to the anomalous anticyclonic circulation, which is a hallmark of atmosphere, is also evident during one series of walking days per summer. Is strongly correlated to as corroborating our hypothesis that 14 marine heat to ocean water air temperature. So once the cyclonic is established, the marine heat wave is generated by local change in flux between the ocean and the atmosphere. Cyclonic line in the left hand. Decreasing cloud cover, increased shortwave radiation at the ocean surface. Anomalies in the left panel. Heat loss for the ocean to the atmosphere, evaporation. due to the combined effects of weak winds and enhanced moisture transport from the continent to the marine heat saturates there above the marine. We also calculated the temperature budget of the ocean mix layer. The time series budget components average in this line dominated by short development of wave radiation and sensible heat flux are less important, and is the yellow and cyan lines, and the zonal and meridional. So, find the remote driver, we also performed the maximum covariance analysis for soil field. The ongoing long wave radiation analysis, which oxy convection over it shows that enhanced convection, which is the negative Indian Ocean, is associated with a pattern that is a reminiscence of the polar pattern. Also looks very similar to over the MJO, with atmosphere. So for those days, right, and what we actually the complete picture that emerged is shown in the schematic, and tropical dip convection in the eastern Indian Ocean, Madden-Julia oscillation, Rossby waves in levels, and ultimately winds and precipitation out both. So we also noticed changes in the currents of these marine heat waves over the recent decades. We noticed an increase not only in the frequency, but also duration, intensity, and marine heat waves. This range size statistically. We more recently showed that the frequency, intensity, and duration of marine heat waves will significantly increase for the. This is from and that the greatest trend in marine heat waves characteristics of duration. Moreover, future trends are driven not only by the long-term warming, but also by intensification of. So we are investigating the impacts of these marine heat waves and on marine ecosystem. We've already identified that in 2013 also decline in a followed the even bigger drop in 2015. There is events during the and finally this is also the biggest producer, supplying 90% of market in Brazil. They are cultivated in shallow waters along the base between the island and the continent. Are greatly affected by
Okay, we can keep going.
Yeah,
Just
thanks.
okay.
Yeah, now it's working good. So as I said, so this region is also the biggest producer of oyster, supplying 90% of the market in Brazil. They are cultivated in the shallow waters along the base between the island and the mainland, and is greatly affected by temperatures. So they also, these extreme temperatures also is very common, lead to the development of pathogenic microorganisms, increasing the risk of infections if consumed by humans. So it's a really problem for us, this. So here I summarize, I put it together in this diagram to summarize the effects of this compound extreme. This is just the event for 2013-14 for Brazil, and involved the drought, heat waves, and marine heat waves. Led to water and power shortage in Southeast Brazil, a region that is heavily populated, home to more than 8 million people, and responsible for 60% of the Brazilian gross domestic product. It also reduced the Brazil soy, coffee, and sugarcane production, impacted food supplies globally, and increasing worldwide price. It decreases the production of oyster and catch of some commercially important fish species while decimating clams along the southern coast of Brazil. This event affected human health by increasing the risks of heat stroke and vector-borne disease. It tripled the case of dengue fatalities in São Paulo. In addition, compound events like that has disastrous, obviously, impact on ecosystem degradation and loss of land and marine biodiversity. So more recently, we investigate the most extreme marine heat waves. This study was led by Alex Gupta from the University of New South Wales in Australia. And it shows, among other things, that a large proportion of the most extreme extratropical marine heat wave events were associated with large, persistent, high pressure system, similar to what I just showed here for a Western South Atlantic. Another recent example of a compound extreme is the 2021 heat dome in Western North America, also caused by a blocking pattern. Nearly 600 people died due to the extreme temperatures and fire in British Columbia, as you might know well, over the summer, and an estimated 1 billion marine organisms have died, including mussels, clams, starfish, etc., with shocking footage of salmon covered with this red lesions. So we are now doing an inventory of marine heat waves in the tropical and South Atlantic and along, and this is the long-term linear trend in marine heat wave cumulative intensity. And they is almost all positive in almost the entire South Atlantic. And this is just during austral summer when the SST is already at its maximum. So we also have identified co-occurrence of compound extreme events of marine heat wave, high acidity and low primary productivity for the period between 1999 and 2018, when these three gridded database data sets overlap. Triple compound events were very rare from 1999 to 2008, but became increasingly common. This is just the difference between the two periods. So the left panel is just a triple compound, but the middle is double compound marine heat wave and low productivity, and the right panel is marine heat wave with high acidity. And the one thing that we discovered is that the triple compound events were widespread in 2016, associated with the major El Nino event of 2015-16, because impact a lot of South Atlantic El Nino. So as I said in the beginning of my talk, this is the good news in terms that we understand a lot about and we can predict ENSO. So here is a recent paper that has been identified the co-occurrence of compound as I said, the good news is that we have a lot of skew of predicting marine heat wave, mainly due to ENSO. And the map on the left indicates marine heat wave forecast skew obtained for 6 global climate models. And this is from 1991 to 2020. The scores range from -1, which means no skew, to 1. A perfect skew, and the figure on the right gives the likelihood of a marine heat wave occurring with some lead time, and this could be provided to resource manager and ocean stakeholders as early warning. So this is the first step that we have to develop a early warning system. So there is some kind of predictability for these events. So this is now I'm getting close to the end, and my final considerations are then supposed to guide our discussion of the panel. And one of the questions is how we define an extreme. And if we do that considering only the hazard, the question is incomplete, in my opinion. So we have framed wrongly the question. And it depends on the purpose, marine ecosystem or human system. We need to know the degree of vulnerability and exposure in response to the hazard, not just analyze the hazard. This requires truly transdisciplinary work. And then I think then we need to think if we're going to use a moving average or not a moving average, because it depends how quick the ecosystem can or not adapt. That's the question, I think. And so, in other words, let's say that the return period of these events decrease, such as the 2021 floods in Germany. From the perspective of the hazards, statistically speaking, they are no longer considered extremes. But we are prepared for these events. The risks or impact continues to be high. So maybe statistically they are not extreme anymore, but their impact is, and that's one of the points that Ted Shepard and I discuss in this perspective. We say that we end up deriving reality from conceptual framework, instead of deriving a conceptual framework from reality. So then I finish my talk.
Thank you. Okay, and to stay here. We have a couple. Great job. We have a couple of minutes for questions since we forgot to pause your clock. And if anyone in the room has a question, I'm just going to repeat it up here for now because we need to do another mic reset for that to work. So, any questions? Yes, Shelly. No, yeah, I'll repeat it. So the question for those online was from Shelly, and she asked, what causes the blocking?
So yeah, there are several drivers, but our climate modes of variability. ENSO can cause this Rossby wave trains that actually it stacks these highs on over the but in the case I was expecting that it was ENSO in the case for the South American South Atlantic, and was actually MEJO, which is the Madden-Julian oscillation, which is subseasonal variability. ENSO is interannual, so they varies from, but it stuck. The blocking was 30 days consecutive, and the more persistent it stay, the tendency is the intensity of the event is higher. But then my point is that we have so much understanding already for droughts and heat waves on land, and it basically, if you look at most of the marine heat waves are associated with this on land, so we already have the knowledge to tap into it and move much quicker forward. That's I think we should do that.
More questions? Any online? Oh, there's one here. Yep.
Yeah, sorry. So an extended question that you say the MDO may be the major driver or some antigen. So we just wonder why this happens so high at the second period rather than some regular based market, because the NJO is basically for the 30 days or 60 days oscillation is for you dictate if you detect some certain events.
So sorry, quickly, the question was, yeah.
So yeah, the Madden-Julian oscillation is a subseasonal oscillation and moves along, and then he's asking how that comes and then gets stuck. So one thing that we notice is that the Indo-Pacific warm pool has increasing size, and then the MEJO now is stuck more over the Indo-Pacific, and then the waves that triggered from there in the atmosphere are different. And that's why you have changes on this blocking kind of system. This is one aspect. ENSO also a different from Eastern Pacific El Nino. For Central Pacific, they have a different wave propagation, and then they affect it differently. But what we notice is that and in the northern hemisphere, you are having more this kind of wavy jet stream too, with the persistent, and then it's causing all these heat waves. Is pretty much the same thing. When they are over the ocean, they are causing marine heat waves. That's I'm not sure if I.
All right, let's thank Regina one more time, especially dealing with technical difficulties. Thank you.
Cool. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to get my stick ready here. Point out some graphs. So yeah, thanks so much. So I am going to give a little bit of a different talk than what we saw previously. In this talk, we're really going to dive into a particular case study on analyzing. I'm going to take my mask off as well. Beard here. And we're going to dive into a particular case study using a statistical framework to model extreme events. And so my mouthful of a title here, using the generalized extreme value distribution to describe interannual variability in the North Atlantic spring bloom and beyond. And so I know many people are interested in phytoplankton blooms, so I hope that you'll get something from the talk. This is a quantitative talk. I'm going to describe a statistical framework that's very general to look at extreme events. So we'll have several statistical formula there. Don't run out on me too quickly. I hope I can take you through them and kind of interpret what they're trying to tell us. And then the and beyond. I think this framework will look at chlorophyll extremes, thinking about phytoplankton blooms. But I think this framework is applicable to many different types of extremes in the ocean. We saw discussions of marine heat waves, biogeochemical extreme events. So the statistical framework is really portable to those types of studies as well. So the particular case study that I'll talk about is a paper just recently published in L&O Letters, thinking about phytoplankton blooms as an extreme event in phytoplankton time series. We'll leverage satellite observations to characterize blooms. And so in this context, we think of the maximum chlorophyll concentration that's observed over the course of the year as a type of extreme event. But again, I'll go through how we can kind of generalize the framework to other types of. So what we'll be using are probability distributions to characterize extremes. We're taking a distributional approach to that description. And so first, why would we want to use probability to model extreme events? So first, I'd contrast this type of distributional or statistical approach to a more kind of event-based approach of extremes, some of which we've seen. Actually, in the previous talks, we had a really nice mix. In Nikki's talk, for example, we looked at the frequency over a large number of events, but also particular events. And in the other talks, we were looking at some of the physical, chemical, biological factors that led to particular extremes. But here we're really looking at trying to quantitatively characterize kind of large collections of extreme events. And I just have a basic kind of cartoon set of probability functions here where we can really start quantitatively characterizing the probabilities of different magnitudes of extreme events. And this probability-based description of extreme events, I would argue, is very useful for things like risk assessment. So, for example, the types of risk an organism may be subjected to in the environment, the probability of certain threshold exceedances, or doing kind of calculations, probability-based calculations over the types of extreme events that an organism might experience over its lifetime. So the outline for the talk, I'll discuss how statistical distributions arise for extreme events, and we'll get into some different definitions of extreme events and how they lead to different types of probability models. I'll go in some detail, the case study for modeling the North Atlantic spring phytoplankton bloom, seeing that the bloom through the lens of extreme values. And then I'll discuss some extensions to the basic framework that I go through, including non-stationary probability distributions, particularly in the context of climate change, which I think is a very important framework. And then also thinking about how we can kind of build environmental drivers into this kind of modeling framework and think about extreme value distributions as a function of environmental conditions, which again, I would argue is quite relevant in the context of climate change. So first, how do probability distributions for extreme events arise? There's really two basic approaches that statisticians have developed to look at characterizing probability functions for extreme events. And the two are referred to as the block maxima approach, which I'll explain what that means, and also the peaks over threshold model. So I have two little cartoons here that I'll take you through just to kind of distinguish these two definitions of extreme events. When you have a sample of measurements, whether they be chlorophyll, oxygen, temperature, et cetera, how do we define an extreme event in this? So the block maxima approach is on the left, where we may have some natural blocking of the samples. And so in my context, we're thinking of chlorophyll extremes over the course of a year. So that leads to a very natural kind of blocking of our samples in this case, yearly bins. And we'll look at the maximum value that these measurements attain over the course of that block. That's the block maxima approach. And statisticians have figured out is that when you have kind of basic conditions about stochasticity in your sample, when you look at these maxima across blocks, there's a probability distribution that describes the maximum of a sequential series of samples. And so I'll discuss that in some detail because that's the approach we used for the spring bloom, thinking about the maximum of the bloom every year. An alternative but highly analogous approach is the peaks over threshold. And we saw that definition in the talks earlier, where we have some threshold, whether it be a lethal threshold for an organismal risk or based on a climatological definition. And we look at the measurements above that threshold and then statistically describe those values that exceed the threshold. And that's referred to as the peaks over threshold model. And there's another distribution that statisticians have figured out that these peaks over thresholds should obey. And so as I mentioned, I'll be using this block maxima approach definition, but the inference and analysis that I go through is highly analogous between the two cases. There are parameters that describe the distribution for the block maxima and peaks over threshold approach, and we'll try to model those parameters. We'll try to map them spatially and interpret them in the context of the underlying ecological dynamics. So I just want to show you this quickly. So I put up the form of the probability function that we use. So if we look back at our picture here, we have a maximum value per block of data. And if we think of the value of that maxima as a variable x, we have a probability function that statisticians have worked out should describe these maxima that you observe sequentially over time. So there's three key parameters that I want to explain to you that really characterizes the shape and kind of the nature of these extremes that will occur in the environment. There's a kind of mean parameter, a location that shifts the expected value of that maximum, the probability of observing a particular maximum. There's the scale parameter that governs how diffuse the distribution is about that maximum. And then the shape parameter, which really governs kind of the heaviness of the tail. So how likely very extreme events are. And so this is the last statistical slide before jumping into the application, looking at phytoplankton blooms. And so those parameters of this function, as I say, are really going to characterize the nature of the extremes and what type of frequency of extremes across magnitudes we expect to see in the environment. So given a sample of data, we want to estimate those parameters, and that's what we'll do in our case study. There's two main approaches, and this is kind of general across a lot of statistical estimation problems, is that we can use maximum likelihood approach or a Bayesian approach to estimating these parameters of the distribution. The maximum likelihood approach is similar to type optimization approaches we use. We have a sample of data, and we vary the three parameters of the distribution to find the parameters that best match our observations. And I'm mentioning here, too, the Bayesian approach, where we may have some expectation about the nature of extremes that we would expect in the environment. And then we update that prior distribution via the likelihood. And I'll just give basic Bayes theorem here. And I wanted to call this out because there's some really fascinating work in the literature making use of this Bayesian approach to modeling extremes. And I'm calling out one paper in particular from Oliver et al., published several years ago now, that I think was really ahead of its time. In this context, the authors were looking at temperature extremes in the environment, but they developed a really clever and I think effective approach at using climate models to derive some expectations for what we might expect to see, the extremes we might expect to see in the environment, and then using fairly limited observations to actually say fairly concrete things about how extremes may be changing. So I just wanted to call this out. I'll be using the maximum likelihood approach in my study, but there's some really fascinating ways. It's really a kind of data assimilation approach to extremes that the authors have developed here from a Bayesian perspective. Okay. So let's get into the seasonal phytoplankton bloom in the North Atlantic. So we're using satellite observations here. I'm showing the climatological chlorophyll map for the North Atlantic, milligrams chlorophyll per meter cubed, observed from MODIS. I'll just mention we used a variety of different chlorophyll products in this study and evaluated the robustness across different products, showing MODIS observations here. I just picked out three locations. One location, given in numbers here, one location, the south of Iceland, second location on the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, and a third location offshore of the Iberian Peninsula. And I have the full MODIS time series for those three locations shown on the right. And so under this block maxima approach, for every year, we pull out the maximum chlorophyll that was recorded from a particular sensor over the course of that year. We have the red dots for each block maxima, so each peak of the chlorophyll record based on this satellite product. And so what we're modeling is the distribution then of those maxima. So we're going to use these probability functions to describe the shape and mean value of these maximal extremes from MODIS. And we do this at 0.5 by 0.5 latitude by longitude resolution. So when you're evaluating how well one of these distributional functions describes extremes, you don't get a point-by-point prediction of a particular extreme. We're thinking about distributions here, so we have to match up how well the shape of the extremes, or the distribution of extremes as measured, corresponds to a probability function that we're using to model those extremes. So the way we do that is by correlating the quantiles, quantile plot between the observed distribution quantiles, so how big was the 10th biggest observation, how big was the 20th biggest, and so on, versus the quantiles that we get from, that's predicted from a fitted extreme value distribution. And we correlate this quantile plot. And so an example from our site 1 here is the values of the chlorophyll extremes observed over the satellite record with a fitted generalized extreme value distribution. And for our 3 sites, I'm just showing the correlation between those observed quantiles and the quantiles. And for purposes here, I just argued to you that we achieved a very satisfactory fit. We compared the goodness of fit between these extreme value distributions and other types of probability functions that can be used to model extremes, like the log normal. And in the paper, we were able to demonstrate that this extreme value distribution that's derived specifically for this purpose was able to better explain the observed maxima than some other distributions. And then what we did, we mapped out spatially the estimated value of the distribution parameters. So I'm showing here the map of the estimated location parameter. Remember, that sets the expected value of the maximum. The scale parameter, that gives you the spread around that maximum. And then the shape parameter, which gives you how heavy the tail is for that maximum value. What I'm showing overlaid here are 500-meter bathymetric contours on each plot, the same contours shown on all 3 plots. And when we did the study, what we found was a very interesting and systematic association between the parameters of this extreme value distribution and basin bathymetry. And as I'll show, a particularly strong association between location or mean value of the extreme and the heaviness of the tail. So we've hypothesized, we're following this up with additional work, that in shelf environments, the nature of the phytoplankton bloom is such that there's fairly rapid shelf stratification, higher nutrient loads that can really drive very anomalously high phytoplankton blooms in particular years based on kind of the rapidity of that stratification and the onset of the bloom. So that's kind of a mechanistic hypothesis of why we may see these heavier tails in shelf environments. And the picture I'm showing here is just another representation of that systematic association between the parameters of this distribution. So what I'm showing in the top right are the relationships between the estimated parameters of this distribution. So on the top left, we have the location or the mean versus the spread, the mean versus the heaviness of the tail, and then the heaviness of the tail versus the spread. And again, the strongest association that we see is between the mean value of the extreme and the heaviness of the tail. So as you move on from open ocean to a coastal shelf environment, we're seeing larger phytoplankton blooms, seasonal blooms, but also a higher probability of very extreme phytoplankton blooms characterized by the heaviness of the tail. And that's just characterized here, looking at kind of on a basin average, how the shape of the extreme value distribution moves from an open ocean environment in the North Atlantic in the cool colors to a more coastal or shelf environment in the red colors. Now, within this framework, we can also start asking questions about how extreme values change over time. And I think this gets to some of the really interesting directions that we can take this framework. So in this study, we used the satellite record to try to evaluate whether we could detect changes in the nature of chlorophyll extremes over time. And we do so in the context of a fairly significant environmental change in the North Atlantic, showing 2 examples here of the linear trend in chlorophyll over time for the over the course of the MODIS record, and as well the linear trend in sea surface temperature. And within this statistical framework, we can describe the parameters of this distribution as functions of time. So this is just a simple example where we take these three parameters of the extreme value distribution and test whether we can find evidence for, in this case, linear changes in the value of those parameters over time. We chose this. The satellite record is still relatively short in this context, so we assumed or tested simple patterns of change. You could think about more complicated temporal variability. And so we tested, within the same kind of estimation framework, instead of estimating a single static parameter, now we estimate two parameters, a background and then a slope with respect to time, which allows us to test the quantitative hypothesis that extremes are changing. And we use, I'm showing here one, we used a variety of model selection metrics where you can ask the question of whether one statistical model fits the data better than another. I'm showing the formula for the Bayesian information criterion, which is one model selection metric that we can distinguish this goodness of fit of one model over the other. And I'm showing here the trends, the estimated trends, so that slope parameter from the previous slide, the estimated trends where a non-stationary model was favored over the stationary model, so where we find evidence for changes. So the location trend actually correlated fairly well with the background trend in mean chlorophyll. And I think that's quite interpretable. As the background mean chlorophyll increases, then the size of the typical phytoplankton bloom also increases. Something that I think more interesting and that we're interested in following up on is that we also found a fairly significant area of the North Atlantic Basin where the data suggests increasingly heavy tails for the distribution of chlorophyll maxima per year. But we tried correlating both the scale and the shape trends in these extremes to the changes in chlorophyll and sea surface temperature, and we actually found fairly weak evidence. So we're still interested in what other processes may explain this trend in the heaviness of the tail, and also thinking about leveraging other data sets to try to test whether that trend is consistent. So I'll just mention one other extension to the framework that I'm really excited about following up with in the future, and that is using the same type of framework where we're thinking about modeling the parameters of an extreme value distribution as a function of environmental covariance. So I've just given a very simple expression here where we might think of the three parameters of our distribution as a function of some relevant environmental factors. So in the context of phytoplankton blooms, we may think that the probability of certain magnitudes of bloom may depend on the environmental temperature, perhaps the intensity of stratification, the available nutrients to fuel the bloom. And if you can write down an expression, could be a very simple linear expression or more complicated functional relationships that you may hypothesize that drive the extreme values, you can use the same type of statistical framework and try to estimate and evaluate the evidence for environmental drivers of those extreme value distributions. And again, you can leverage the same type of estimation frameworks that I've shown you. I think there's really interesting applications for thinking about this context, this framework in the context of climate change. We can establish relationships between environmental factors and the nature of extremes in the environment. We might be able to say something about how the probability of particular extreme events may change into the future. So to summarize, so I tried to present to you phytoplankton blooms as a kind of case study for this type of distribution-based modeling of biogeochemical extremes. I think the framework is highly portable to other variables, other timescales that we might be interested in. So I showed you how there's different definitions of extremes. This block maxima versus this threshold-based approach leads to different probability distributions, but the framework is highly analogous. There are parameters that govern that distribution that we can then model through time or as a function of environmental conditions. And as I mentioned, these modeling these changes with respect to time and with respect to the environment, I think, is an important framework to think about in the context of. And I'll just reiterate this combination of prior information from models and combining that prior information from models with observations, I think, is a really powerful framework. It kind of brings data assimilation into the world of extreme value modeling. So in the context of blooms, we're doing some follow-up mechanistic work, thinking about, again, why shelf environments may lead to these different shapes of distribution than open ocean, why the bloominess is different as characterized here. Also interested in how extreme blooms affect food webs, fisheries recruitment, and carbon exports. Again, thinking about the biogeochemical implications of extreme phytoplankton blooms in particular. And I'll just mention at the end, we talked a lot in previous sessions about multivariate extremes or compound extremes. And there's a very natural extension to this framework for thinking about multivariate extremes called copula functions. Those in the extreme value world will know that term. Basically, correlation functions that connect different characterizations of oxygen and so on. So how to link these distributions together in the context of compound events. So didn't have time to talk about that today, but there is a very interesting and increasingly important extension to think about compound events. And that's all I have. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Greg, that was an excellent talk. I know you're also a Yale alum.
Indeed.
Yeah, me too. I have a comment and then perhaps a question.
Please.
So I have also worked a lot in that Northwest Atlantic system, particularly in the Shelf Sea, trying to understand the mechanistic drivers of blooms. And you're probably aware of Bill Lee's work, right, where he shows the strong correlation between a stratification index and the change in abundance between small and large cells.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was really gratifying to see that borne out in the likelihood modeling as well. My question is as follows. One of the things that we have seen in the system is that pre-spring bloom or prior year preconditioning of the water column also seems to control the extreme events. So if there's deep convective mixing in the prior winter, it follows forward. So I don't know if that lends itself to a kind of lag analysis or something like that.
No, that's exactly what just came to mind when you mentioned that. So I mentioned, linking these parameters to environmental conditions is very much the next step for this work, and just a really generally useful framework. But exactly like you say, so what that nutrient load is doing to prime the bloom, I think would, as you say, have a very important impact on what kind of extremes we're going to expect. So thinking, and it's fascinating to say the previous season's deep mixing. So that's a great clue to where we should be looking for the environmental covariates, right? It's not necessarily the supply that's happening at the particular time. What's more important for the nutrient load is the nature of the deep mixing beforehand. Yeah.
And also thank you for using bays. Love you.
All right. Thumbs up.
We need beers.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
So Norm Nelson from UCSB has a question.
All right.
Would this kind of approach work with spatial data as sparse as Argo float data? Because in that case, things like mixed layer depth could be a better variable than SST to relate to bloom magnitude.
Yep. Yeah, I think the answer to the question is definitely yes. You know, the setup of the analysis would be slightly different. We wouldn't be thinking of characterizing extreme value distributions by this grid box by grid box level. We might be thinking about extreme value distributions as an Argo float is moving in space. So absolutely, in fact, we're thinking a lot about digging into the Argo database specifically in this context, and I think it's probably some of the nicest data to think about, you know, tracking how extremes change in both time and space, leveraging the Argo data. So yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, nothing works for you.
So anyway, so yeah, that's not, so sorry. And when I was looking at the inventory for the South Atlantic, we noticed that where the trends on the mean are higher, it's not the same places that the trend on the extremes are higher. So in different places, the tail gets fatter, but then the mean doesn't move, and vice versa. And I think it is related to the physical processes. Mm. Regions where are more conducive or air-sea interactions, which are higher frequency, it might be the case, which is the analog of your case in the shelves where you have a bigger variability. Yep. And places where you have ocean processes, currents and everything, which has inertia, then it's different. So I wonder if that is maybe where your thoughts about this difference where you have different behavior. Yeah.
No, it's a great point. And you know, we weren't expecting that behavior where the heaviness of the tail scales with the mean of the distribution. That was a bit of a discovery, right? It could have been the other way. It could have been that, you know, the tail is being driven by another set of processes unrelated to the average value, the average annual value. So that was something that was kind of interesting to follow up on, but the opposite is true. So just in the general point is how the shape, how kind of the dependent structure within the shape of the distribution changes under different sets of processes, I think is fascinating. You know, does the tail get fatter with the mean or not? Is kind of a first order question that you can ask from system to system. And it has a lot of implications, right? If the tail is getting heavier with the mean change, then that's a very important implication for the mean change. It's saying that not only the mean is changing, but the probability of extreme events is changing with it. So it's a first order question that I think you ask across systems, really.
All right, let's give all of our speakers one more round of applause. All right, and now we're going to have our speakers join us up front. We're going to have a brief discussion here and try to keep ourselves a little bit on time. I know everyone's getting tired. Since we're all getting tired and it's the end of the day, we thought we could put up a bit of a primer here for some potential discussion topics, so feel free to draw from this if you would like. Otherwise, you might have some burning questions that you had written down. And we did have one question that was on Zoom earlier that if Nikki is with us, we thought he could actually start off by answering, but I think it's applicable to all of our speakers as well. And I'll repeat it briefly here from our fancy screenshot. So the question was, the warm blob in the Pacific discussed by Nikki was an extreme event in spatial and temporal extent and duration. What is our observational or analytical sensitivity to detect smaller, less extreme events? And where in the ocean do we have sufficient data density to do this? So Nikki, if you're with us and you want to maybe start off by addressing that, that would be great. And then some of the other speakers can chime in as well.
Okay, thank you. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great, thank you. By now it's actually night here. Great. Of course, the blob event was very large and in that sense very accessible for a lot of different tools. So we definitely saw it very well with satellite observations. People saw it also in the Argo array, could actually trace that event in the vertical. And in that sense, we were quite lucky. I think when it comes to many of the smaller scale events that I also mentioned, I mean, I showed the distribution of events, and you saw that the majority of the events are relatively small and short-lived. I think there we probably need to go and use a statistical approach. Probably it's a bit too tricky to say, okay, well, let's target in a planned fashion for that. But again, for example, the autonomous survey mode, whether it's an Argo or floats or some other means, if we sample often enough, we will actually get those by chance. And I think by accumulating that evidence, we can start to see these events vis-a-vis other events. And as a matter of fact, we started to do this now, for example, with pH sensors from biogeochemical Argo. It requires a very good understanding of the background distribution. That's one of the challenges, so they can differentiate the anomalies. But I think we're getting there. And I think by combining the different approaches from observations and then ultimately also the modeling aspect, I think we can make some inroads. And some of the things that were mentioned in terms of really fusing, for example, statistical models with data and models is numerical models in that sense, I think is a very, very fruitful approach here.
Thanks, Nikki, and we appreciate you being with us still since we know it's so late there. Thank you so much. Okay, we have another question for you. Okay, there we go. Even the mics are getting tired. Okay, so this is a question from Bill Miller, who's probably on a highway somewhere in Georgia based on the picture he sent us. Is there any evidence that the spatial location of extreme events has changed as warming progresses? I'm thinking that biomes with habitual extremes may result in organisms acclimated to deal with these extremes and lessen predicted impact.
Yeah, I thought the question was for Nikki, but I'll just mention that I completely agree in the context. Can you hear through this microphone? Okay. Yeah. I kept my lapel mic. The question of acclimation is fascinating. I was taken by a paper. I know Carlos Duarte was an author on PNAS, but they looked at the oxygen threshold, the lethal thresholds for oxygen for a variety of species, and they made the point that as particular organisms were exposed to the kind of more mild extremes, they built up a capacity to withstand those extremes. So after repeated exposure, the lethal threshold for that extreme actually changed, and this is over the course of the organism's life. So this question of how changing extremes and also changing organisms' capacity to withstand the extremes. Question. So that's more of a comment than an answer to the question, but just a fascinating area.
Not that I would have the answer here either. I think this is exactly. I mean, I think Regina mentioned this is a truly transdisciplinary question, and I think it is. And if I'm using trans now, also from the perspective of animals and other organisms in the ocean, I think my guess. I mean, I'm really guessing here. We'll find everything. We'll find species that have an extraordinary capacity to adapt and withstand very, very extreme events through all kinds of mechanisms. So hibernation, other mechanisms involving sort of other life forms or whatever. I mean, nature is enormously imaginative, and I think that's probably the reason why nature was so tough in surviving even the hardest of all climatic extremes in the past. So I'm not worried that we're going to lose biology, by no means. I think that's a wrong perspective. I think what we're worried about is that we have a couple of super sensitive groups out there who will not have that high adaptive capacity, whether it's through acclimatization at the organismic level or through sort of more genetic evolutionary, revolutionary, or even macroevolutionary methods. So, and I think it's I guess those subgroup that are sensitive. First of all, I don't think we have a good understanding who they are. I think that's maybe the first challenge. And secondly, to find out, okay, what are the thresholds that are really matter here, and the challenges are quite manifold, because let's say if you look at a lot of the classical studies so far, we often look at intensity, so how strong of an event, how strong an event is and what it does. But there are also the other metrics, like the duration, the recurrence, the abruptness. All of those metrics will have a significant impact as well. And so I think we need to start looking at the problem from all the different angles to understand what it means. And I close actually with a statement by Regina, where she said, we tend to look at the problem from the statistical side and find in the end, what does it do to organisms? I totally with you. Actually, we need to look the other way around. And so we need to think, okay, who are the vulnerable ones and what we learn from this? I think the reason why I didn't do that as much as I wish I had done it is simply because we know these things just so few organisms. And so we end up starting with the statistical approach. Fundamentally, you're absolutely right, Regina.
Can I just add something? For the Amazon forest, we have a good handling about it. So the trees that are in the edge, or the deforestation, they are more exposed to streams, so they are much more resilient than the ones that are actually in a deep Amazon that never being exposed. So if a drought occurs in a core, then it's much more devastating than they were in a edge. So we have a lot to learn from the land. There is a lot of, and they are plants, you know, they can't run away. So, but they already evolved to. So that's the whole point of it.
Okay, I have another question for Regina. They're flying in here. Wow. Okay. This is from Zhelun Wu from University of Delaware. I read your 2019 paper previously and have one question. MJO usually propagates southward. I just wonder if there are other similar systems that can trigger atmospheric locking in the Northern Hemisphere.
Actually, MJO also propagates to the Northern Hemisphere, and there are papers that actually that same year it caused the droughts in California. And I wonder if it actually is related to the blob, because it was actually the same year. And it was winter in Northern Hemisphere, but it was summer in Brazil, or in the Southern Hemisphere, South America. So there are evidences that they cause tube blocking in the western coast of U.S. and also in the Atlantic. Less so, but yeah, they propagate to the Northern Hemisphere too.
Yeah, I wanted to ask whether in Nikki's video there were all these eddies, right? We saw these events happening over and over again. What's the potential to use those sort of as a place to understand these ecological effects that we were talking about in the previous question? Is that just a matter of we haven't gone there and done it yet? Is that a good idea? Is there a reason that wouldn't work from an impacts perspective?
I can start, but I hope the others will chime in as well. I do think that provides an opportunity for sure. I think one of the challenges we have is to identify early on which one of those will kind of form really long-lasting, deeply propagating ones, because sometimes they form something really look big, but then it kind of falls into two pieces, or sometimes you have mergers. But fundamentally, once you have identified one that has kind of escaped the coastal zone, this actually does provide an opportunity for such studies. And that there have been some by chance studies of such eddies from the Germans, for example, in Atlantic, where they looked essentially at was a really low oxygen eddy that was tracked and looked at, and had actually very specific populations of zooplankton. I think because there was kind of the study was by happenstance, they didn't really have a good control to compare. But I do think those sort of natural experiments can provide at least some indications.
I'm not an expert on that at all, to be sure, but I started out my PhD working in the California current ecosystem, and that's one region where that you're modeling where there is actually a lot of data density on the biological side. And then if you imagine like sort of the tails of what they're modeling, I can't remember if your grid hit HOTS, but like maybe there are some places where you actually have the frequency of biological data to begin to couple the two. But from my perspective, which is outside the field, I was like, gosh, it seems like there's a data monitoring gap at the same scale, but there are a couple spots where maybe you can do it.
Yeah, no, I was really taken. I know the work that Nikki is referencing, where they tracked individual eddies, the very low oxygen eddies. I think the term that they used in that paper was rotating death spiral, is that they noticed a very high mortality of macrozooplankton within the eddy as they tracked it. So I think it's a beautiful example.
The perspective of the tool is very difficult. You know, we don't have the high resolution ocean modeling, and then to couple to ecological modeling to have all the answers is we're still a little bit far away from I guess, challenging the mesoscale or sub-mesoscale in the ocean simulated that well enough.
I can repeat it. I can repeat it for you. If you
one
want. Sorry, Nikki.
Oh, perfect.
Thank you.
Hi, Samantha Sidlecki from University of Connecticut. Thanks all for great talks. Really cool session. I was really wondering if we could kind of circle back to one piece that wasn't the primary focus, but was mentioned in different directions in some of the different talks. And that is what the pH direction in response to the marine heat waves and some of the carbon variables. And so I think, you know, coming back several years ago, we wrote a newsletter piece in a Clivar journal that just highlighted some of the carbon variables in the Pacific Northwest and in the North Pacific. And it seemed like the marine heat wave, at least relative to the years prior, like alleviated some of the carbon stress, like improved, you know, the pH, like made the pH lower or higher, sorry, increased the pH, lowered the PCO2, you know, because of the exhaling of CO2 from the warming. And that was mostly focused on coastal data. And I think that Sam Mogen recently from Nikki Lewandowski's group, you know, published an article showing that line P also experienced that kind of amelioration. But in the, I wasn't sure about the direction from the increasing acidity, but I know in Nikki's talk, he showed that there was a lower pH during the compound events. So I was just wondering if, which is consistent with the paleo record that was shown, right? The PETM kind of showed that there was that during that longer warming event, that there was a lower pH, increased carbon stress, right, so to speak, for organisms. I guess I was wondering if, if Nikki could clarify if that was in fact the case from yours, and then maybe we could talk about that kind of spread of directions that was presented here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, what I showed was these were model simulations, and I'm actually Luke is looking right now also in more detail at his data product to fully understand what's happening. So you definitely have a thermodynamic effect just simply by the effect of temperature on the dissociation constant, and that leads actually to a higher H plus concentration, i.e. a lower pH. So that connects actually temperature. Then on top of that, you do have sort of chemical changes happening through changes in biological production, or the balance between particularly the balance between production and respiration. And that's more important further down in the water column, because it depends now, for example, in the temperature response, we see this for a lot of organisms, the temperature dependence is stronger for the respiration than for photosynthesis. So the first order response is to increase respiration more than you increase photosynthesis. And so that would actually lead to a strong respiration, lowering the pH. And then on top of that, you have, of course, the dynamical changes. As you say, outgassing reduces the DIC concentration again, et cetera, et cetera. I have to say that we haven't fully analyzed all elements yet in order to understand the balance, but you see a bit the different direction. And the last I haven't mentioned yet are changes in alkalinity on top of these things. So it's not quite trivial to, and it could well be that in certain regions, the balance play out in different ways.
But did you look at you said you're working, sorry, are you working on comparing it to some data now? Is that right?
Yep, exactly. But I need to double check with Luke what's the latest news on the detailed analysis. One element we're still struggling with, indeed, actually the alkalinity. And I've seen actually a chat, so maybe Luke can actually write something. I'm not sure he's allowed to talk.
I guess just to pipe up here, I've been playing with some really simplified modeled worlds in CGenie. A student of mine was working with Andy Ridgewell and Dominique Holza, and just to reiterate what Nikki's saying, like the relative balance of the physical forcing versus like the local biological forcing depends on like the global boundary conditions, but also where you are in the world, just in terms of the coupling and decoupling. At least that's what we're seeing in these super simplified worlds. But we also see that when we look back at like the permanent El Nino time interval, we went to measure pH gradients actually in the Eastern Tropical Pacific because we wanted to put to rest some of the debates over the temperature data. And we were convinced that if we saw, the temperature data was suggesting decreased upwelling, so we're like, okay, well the pH should show like the pH, like you should see decreased upwelling, so it won't be as acidic, right? But it actually got way more acidic, and it was because the global climate models actually showed this intermediate water was getting really old, so there was lower volume being upwelled, but per volume it was way more acidic. So it totally blew away like our sort of simplest default explanation because of the relative balance of these physical versus like biological factors and the relative balance of like intermediate water circulation versus like the surface ocean. So yeah, I think it's just complicated is what I'm saying.
Thanks. Hi, thanks everybody. That was a really great session. My name is Andrea Fossbender. I'm at NOAA PMEL. I had a question for Telly. I think it's like a pretty big question in the climate community, how natural variability will scale with the mean state. And I guess I was kind of wondering from your work or, related work in paleoclimate, have people looked at the rate of evolution or adaptation and how that changes with the mean state?
There are records that look at things like diversification and origination through time in different clades. So you can see it phylogenetically in the clades that aren't well fossilized, or you can see it in, the morphological species that you see in the fossil record. And so we do see, so there are changes in like diversification rate on long time scales. Like there are time periods where you're accumulating species because the diversification rates are high. And ironically, there's a, peak accumulation during the Eocene, which is really warm, but there's also another peak closer to the present day that maybe Flavia is going to talk a little bit about. So there's different reasons that you see it, and it probably has to do with different types of habitats that are being opened in the pelagic realm. I think we've moved away from this. The pelagic realm is homogeneous, and it's a question of different types of heterogeneity. But with regards to the higher frequency question, I think all of us are really interested in what's going on at the higher frequency and how that might be interacting. And that's, I'm trying to rack my brain. I can't think of anything that really ties down like the question of high frequency variability, but I'll keep thinking about it and we can talk.
We hear from you, Heather, and then I think we might have to move on to our happy hour and poster.
Great. This is just a follow-on comment from Luke Gregor regarding Sam Mogan's work and all about metrics. They use aragonite saturation state as a metric for OA, while in my work, we look at hydrogen ion concentration. The latter responds more strongly to temperature compared with saturation state. Bottom line, choice of the metric you use to define ocean acidification plays a big role.
Great. This was a really stimulating discussion. You can corner all of our lovely speakers during the poster session. I'm sure Nikki will accept many emails, and let's thank everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.